Hi, welcome to another episode of Layperson Logic. My name is Paul Brady. I'm the director of inbound marketing at the Center of National Investing, where we talk about different solutions for our economy that could help us fund some of the things that we're not funding today. So along those lines, I've had discussions both online and in person with people where I've talked about an example of what National Vesting, the Center for National Investing's program is based on in large part, which is quantitative easing. So I've had this discussion with people, and it's interesting because the result is normally that you explain in high-level terms how the government works with quantitative easing and what happens between the Treasury and the Fed and how debt is handled, and people just scratch their head and say, there's no way that can be true. That just seems like nonsense. So what I'd like to do today is walk through a little bit of a high-level explanation of that, what that is again. And then what I am going to do is I'm going to walk through a little bit of a history on quantitative easing and give you some real-world context as to how that's used and how it's applied and was applied in our country, principally during the Great Recession of 2008-2009. So let me start by talking a little bit about quantitative easing. So I'm going to show you a chart here, and or graph rather. And so on the graph you'll see a representation for the Fed, Federal Reserve, which is in most parts of the world is known as the central bank, the Treasury, and then there's an indication of debt and government spending. So I've used the example before, and I'll use it again here, the program for cash for clunkers. Dr. Whitehair's talked about this in detail as well. But let me first explain that the Treasury, in quantitative easing, the Treasury will create a debt. That debt will then be purchased by the Fed, who then is able to, and economists don't necessarily like this, but you could say retire that debt. But basically they're purchasing the debt, and that money becomes available to the Treasury again for, as shown in the diagram, government spending. So if you follow the arrows in the diagram, Treasury creates the debt is bought by the Federal Reserve. That money now becomes available for spending through the Treasury, and it's used for government spending. So in the case of cash for clunkers, it was used for paying for the rebate program that was in the billions, so that we could stimulate spending in the economy at a time when we needed to stimulate spending. We were in a serious recession. During the Obama administration, what they'd done in 2008 and 2009 timeframe was to create this program so that people who turned in their old cars, or AKA clunkers, were able to then buy a new car and get a substantial rebate. And so people might say, well, where'd the money come for that rebate? Quantitative easing. And what happened to that money? Did it cause was there a lot added to the deficit? Was there a hyperinflation or a spike in inflation at all? And the answer is no. Of course, the best example would be the military budget. When you look at the military budget today and you examine the amount, staggering amount of money spent on the military in the United States, even in this last realm, somewhere in the area, in this last budget, somewhere in the area of $70 billion was added onto an already gigantic military budget. So people don't seem to ask those questions. As Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez points out, no one questions it when it's spent on the military, but everyone questions it when it's spent on other things. So without getting too, I'm not trying to get politicized here, but just trying to give you some examples of what the modern thought is out there. So let's jump back a little bit and let's talk about some history here. We'll start with the Bank of England in 2008. And so back in 2008, the Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, and Alistair Darling, the chancellor, had worked on, and as I'm looking at an article from Heather Stewart in 2008 from The Guardian, where she states that, their economy was on intensive care, much like at that point the United States was in serious trouble. So looked at and you'd said that, with much of the financial system on life support, Stewart says, Mervyn King and Alistair Darling are preparing to resort to ever more dramatic and risky remedies. So one of those things they did, and they talk about it in the article a couple of times, is how they follow the lead of the United States in many respects, and not financial markets and the financial well-being of the country notwithstanding, it's the same deal. So the central bank's great fear is that the economy deteriorates, Stewart says. Interest rates are cut close to zero, and inflation gets very low or negative. The economy slides into what is known as a liquidity trap. No one feels like spending or making new investments. Everyone hangs on to their cash, and the economy is driven even further into decline. So the United States was in a similar situation where we had suffered similar circumstances. And so then they went on to say, that's where Japan got stuck during its lost decade, the 1990s, in a topsy-turvy world in which prices were plunging, anxious consumers were worried about spending money, and the recession and deflation went hand in hand. But there's something interesting about this, because when you look at Japan, and some say, well, how can Japan go into negative interest rates? How can that even be possible? How does all that work? And how do they get out of that slide? Well, I give you one guess. It's quantitative easing. So let's see what they said in the article here. And it was well illustrated. So Japan finally managed to escape by resorting to what economists call quantitative easing, roughly equivalent in everyday language to letting rip the printing press and spraying free money into the economy. Now, I wouldn't quite put it that way, and I don't think other economists would put it quite that way, but that's how this author put it. But the bottom line is, regardless of how it's described, Japan was that lost decade and that amount of time that they spent in a sustained recession was changed and ultimately, helped them escape it, as the author put, by using quantitative easing. And so they also talk about, the author also talks about monetary policy as a medicine. Let me give you a little bit of detail on what they say there. So they're saying even if every dose of monetary policy medicine is passed on to ordinary firms and families, once rates get close to naught, meaning zero, it may be time for a fresh approach, which is why King and his colleagues are beginning to weigh up quantitative easing. They went on to say later in the article that orthodox monetary policy is not working terribly well at the moment. Quantitative easing is going to become a consistent theme that's very clear. Central banks are asking, what else have we got up our sleeves? So a lot of people were looking at quantitative easing, and in the desperation of that time in 2008, the central bank, or the Bank of England rather, was looking at trying to find solutions for the problem that they were dealing with in the recession, much like the United States was. And I know at the time in 2008, a lot of people thought the U.S., some U.S. economists in the Obama administration and people who were advising them were crazy for talking about quantitative easing. They thought it would lead to hyperinflation, and there was a lot of debate about it. But ultimately, we're in the longest sustained growth period that we've been since the Great Recession, and that was due much in part, or at least the getting out of the recession was due much in part to quantitative easing. So let's talk about a different example now. So we talked about 2008, the Bank of England. Let's talk about George Washington University speech that former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke gave in 2012. And again, the theme is a discussion of quantitative easing. And what made, as a matter of fact, Ben Bernanke had taken, I don't know if it's historically accurate, but he'd taken a lot of credit for that during that time. And so it's not something he's running away from. And I know Larry Summers, under the Obama administration, early on was a proponent, and then puzzlingly later a detractor of quantitative easing. So I'm not quite sure why he did that, but let's stick to this for a second. So in 2012, Stephanie Kelton wrote an article called "Where Did the Fed Reserve Get All That Money?" And in the article, she writes that Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke gave his 4th lecture at George Washington University. This is back in March 30th of 2012, so it's the 29th, yesterday. Buried in the lecture beginning in around 1918 in the video, Ben Bernanke explained where the Fed got all the money to pay for the assets it purchased as part of quantitative easing policies. And again, don't forget, the U.S. was purchasing a lot of debt, purchasing a lot of bad debt during as part of the collateralized debt obligations, those packages, purchasing a lot of that and in an effort to help bring the U.S. out of recession. So let's talk a little bit about what they said, Stephanie Kelton said after that. So she said that the Federal Reserve, like any bank, can acquire an asset simply by crediting a bank account. In other words, the bank pays by creating money. As Alan Greenspan explained, the Fed has an unlimited capacity to spend in the U.S. dollars. It can pay trillions of dollars with a single keystroke. Here is what Chairman Bernanke said going forward. So that's a point I make a lot, and it's a great point, is that the U.S. has a sovereign economy, a sovereign currency rather. And with a sovereign currency, you can literally generate, as Stephanie Kelton says here, Alan Greenspan explained, the Fed has an unlimited, and I just want to stress that again, an unlimited capacity to spend in U.S. dollars. It can pay trillions with a single keystroke. And it's actually interesting because I hadn't read this article until the other day, and I've been saying that to a lot of people. It's like, I don't think you understand that the government can just press a button, a single button, keystroke, and generate lots and lots of money and pay off all sorts of things. And so that's not to say that I'm discussing helicopter money. There are certain restrictions and limitations on what they can do, but there aren't a lot. And if you listen to what Stephanie Kelton says with modern monetary theory, as well as quantitative easing, there's actually precedent for some of this. And that's why I gave you the example of the Bank of England pulling itself out of recession, Japan pulling itself out of recession, and then later the United States pulling itself out of recession, and then having the longest sustained period of growth in our history. So let me go back to this article for a minute. So what Bernanke said was, now you might ask the question, well, the Fed is going out and buying $1 trillion of securities. How do we pay for that? And the answer is that we paid for those securities by crediting the bank accounts of the people who sold them to us. And those accounts at the banks showed up as reserves that the banks could hold with the Fed. So the Fed is a bank for the banks. Now think about that for a minute. Earlier we discussed how the Treasury can create a debt and the Federal Reserve can buy it. Well, in much more complex terms here, this is exactly what Bernanke's saying here. The Fed is a bank for the banks. It can buy this debt. So what does that mean? Well, it means that that money becomes available for government spending. And that's exactly what we've been saying. So if you look at it, right, he goes on to say that banks can hold deposit accounts with the Fed essentially, and those are called reserve accounts. And so as the purchase of securities occurred, the way we pay for them was basically by increasing the amount of reserves that the banks had in their accounts for the Fed. So in much more concrete terms, you have a former chairman of the Federal Reserve saying that, look, we have a sovereign currency. We can spend and generate unlimited amounts of money by pressing a keystroke, which is exactly what people have a really hard time believing. So when I say it, I'm not an economist. My friends scratch their heads. They do one of these. And they say, I don't really believe you. And that's okay, because the first time I heard it, I didn't believe it either. I thought it sounded like nonsense. But, as Stephanie Kelton had mentioned in an article I talked about earlier, it's understanding how the economy and how monetary policy works in our economy is what people lack. Sometimes even economists don't understand it, or they debate its effectiveness or debate whether we should be doing it at all. But the fact remains that we've seen Japan do it. We've seen the Bank of England do it. We've seen the Federal Reserve do it in 2008. And every single time they were able to generate large sums of money, in the case of the United States, to purchase these collateralized debt obligations, all these bad debts, and then take that off the books, so to speak. So let's talk about one more thing. It's an article about Stephanie Kelton. Now this last one was 2012. This is 2015. And so she's kind of described as, self-described rather, as a deficit owl. And this article is by Mark Sheff, and it's an investmentnews.com article, 2015, February 5th. And what he quotes Stephanie Kelton as saying is that, an owl would put the deficit in context. So a lot of people, to stop for a second there, so a lot of people are overly concerned about the deficit, even when doing these programs with quantitative easing. When Obama campaigned in 2008, he was talking about, hey, you got to pull your credit card out to pay for these things, and that's not a sustainable thing. And Stephanie Kelton has said time and time again that, and it just makes perfect sense. The American household, that analogy doesn't work. People have budgets. I have a budget. You have a budget. We all have budgets, but we're not the U.S. government. We don't have a sovereign currency. So making the analogy that, I'm going to break out the credit card and I'm going to pass that debt on to my kids, actually it's more of a Republican talking point than a Democratic one. But Obama made that point, and plenty of Republicans have made that point as well. But I'm not trying to blame one party or the other. I'm just trying to say that when you look at it, it's simply not true, regardless of who says it. So let's go on and see what she continues to say. So what she continues to go on saying is that an owl, again, would put the deficit in context. It's not about affordability in real terms. It's about inflation. And that's so key. I've read a lot of what Dr. Kelton talks about, and it's very much in line with Dr. Whitehair, the head of the Center for National Investing, talks about. It's not about whether we can spend the money or press a keystroke to generate the money. It's about inflation. That's the marker we're looking at. And when you look at the enormous amount of money we spend on the military, just by pressing a button and adding $70 billion, you don't see that. And as well, you don't see it when in 2008, when the United States pressed a button and generated billions for several quantitative easing programs to help buy this bad debt, as well as fund stimulus programs, case in point, cash for clunkers. So she goes on saying that she said that the key to a stronger economy is get money circulating through consumption. Capitalism runs on sales, she said, and spending creates income. Well, no doubt, and that's something that has always puzzled me about austerity. And actually, if anything else, quantitative easing has shown that austerity has been a failure in the countries it's been used in. Europe had struggled, large parts of Europe had struggled long after the U.S. had started to pull itself out of the Great Recession, because they went on a program of austerity and tightening the belts. And that's exactly the opposite of what people who are proponents of using quantitative easing and also in similar respects modern monetary theory are saying. They're saying that that's not the answer. You don't want to cut off the oxygen to a patient on the table when they're dying. You want to give them more oxygen. You want to try and save their life. Cutting back is not going to help. So she went on also to, the article went on also to say that Kelton is a proponent of keeping the deficit in context and balancing the economy rather than the budget. And at the Center for National Investing, we talk a lot about a balanced economy. That's our goal. So there's a lot of synergy here when you read some of these other programs, when they talk about modern monetary theory, when they talk about programs along the lines of how you use quantitative easing to help. Now, we're not necessarily saying that we're promoting those programs, but what we're saying is there's overlap between them. And we agree a lot with the idea that austerity is not the way to go. That would be a failure. And that quantitative easing, which is very much what the national vesting is based on in our nonprofit, talks about that. So, she went on to say that, or the article, wanted to say that, this was a new way of looking at things easily absorbable by people who understand accounting. It was a paradigm shift at the time. This is, like I said, this is back in 2015. So since then, she's spoken at several events, and at one of those events in particular, an individual named Alex Petrovic, who is the owner of Petrovic Financial Services, makes, again, the same point that we've seen throughout this discussion, that, there is ample proof that quantitative easing was able to provide this government the stimulus that we need, the spending that we need, without causing inflation, regardless of the deficit. So what he went on to say as part of the article, Petrovic said that Ms. Kelton's ideas have been proven correct by the Federal Reserve bond buying program, so-called, again, quantitative easing, since the 2008-2009 recession. The United States has recovered economically, while Europe, which concentrated on austerity instead of growth, is still struggling. And that's the very point that I wanted to make today. I want people to understand that it's not, there's a lot of complex discussion about this. When people talk about the economy, when you hear economists talk on TV, a lot of it's just gibberish. They talk about things in language that I would hazard to guess that most of the news people interviewing them don't even understand. And the arguments against things like quantitative easing and all that are, they're not borne out by empirical evidence. So empirical evidence and what we've seen in the past, the Bank of England used quantitative easing to pull themselves out of a recession. Japan used quantitative easing to pull itself out of a recession. That's after a decade of finally considering what? Quantitative easing. And once they considered it, they pulled themselves out of the recession. And the United States pulled themselves out of recession, has the longest sustained recovery in the history of the country, thanks to quantitative easing. So when people tell you that the United States government, again, the Treasury is able to generate a debt of which the Fed then buys, which has been described in a number of different ways in my discussions here, those are all examples of quantitative easing, and they work. My name is Paul Brady, and I'm the Director of Inbound Marketing with the Center for National Investing. I hope you've enjoyed this, and please visit our website, centerfornationalinvesting.org, and if you want